Thank you so much. It's nice to be here. I have some very old friends here, and this is such a distinguished place in the history of American educational research, so it's just nice to be a part of your community. I usually visit later in the year when it's colder, so I remember why I live in Arizona. But this will do. This will remind me, so that's nice. What I thought I would do is just share with you some of the background to the book, some of the way we were thinking in producing the book, and then some of the highlights from the book. We did the book with 19 graduate students. That's a unique thing, but we did that because Gene Glass and I were complaining about all the stupid things people were doing in education, and we would use that word and other words I won't use in public, and about people who were saying really awful things about our public schools that weren't true. And we kept complaining, and we didn't do anything about it until I thought of the Al Franken model. And the Al Franken model was basically Al Franken from Saturday Night Live wanted to get into politics and be serious, and he didn't know how to quite do that. So he hired I think 9 graduate students at Harvard and said, I'm rich, I'll pay your way to Harvard while you're here, but I want you to fact check me, and I want these things said in a way that I can't be faulted for. And so he wrote the book Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, which is a very good model for what Gene Glass and I wanted to say. So we did it with our graduate students too. You all know the nature of the stupid things. No Child Left Behind. 100% of our children were to be proficient above average this year. We have about 45 days left. And I don't think we're going to make it. Obama doubled down on stupidity with the use of VAMs, value-added models, using student test scores to make judgments about teachers. That's an inference that goes much too far. Validity is the keystone for any test we have, and there is no sense that the validity is high enough with the VAMs to make inferences about teachers. And something, as I studied that, and we thought how stupid it is to rely on them, Jim Popham and I were working on instructional sensitivity issues, and we discovered that there isn't a single test used in the United States, possibly in the world, that has ever gone through a filtering system that says, if a good teacher taught a unit well, for which an item might reflect that unit, would the item actually change in the proportion of kids who pass it? Okay? Now, if you want to make an inference about a teacher being good or bad, the item has to have enough sensitivity to shift. There isn't a single test that's ever run that screen. So we have no idea if the tests are instructionally sensitive, by which we're making inferences about teachers, which strikes me as the height of ludicrousness and a validity problem to deal with. So we finally said, let's write that book, there's the cover of it. We initially wrote the book as 50 myths that threaten America's public schools, but as we got into it, we discovered these are not just myths, some people are lying. And we thought the Al Franken model was closer to the truth, so we put lies in the title. We wanted to use research and logic to point out the fallacies that were going around. We took as our models things like this. Thomas Jefferson, ridicule is the only weapon which can be used against unintelligible propositions. Ridicule is fun, so we wrote the book as kind of snarky. Those of you who have read it know what we mean. There's a lot of things in there we shouldn't have said, but we did anyway. Senator Patrick Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you are entitled, sir, to your own opinions, but not your own facts. An old saying, quod gratis asseratur, gratis negatur, that which is alleged without proof may be dismissed without explanation. just get out of here is the proper response to some of the things we hear in education. And the one we used in our book, educational reform is a euphemism for the destruction of public education. This is a real problem for us because there are lots of people who claim they're reformers, and some of them are school destroyers in reformers' clothing and public school destroyers. And we have to be very careful to distinguish among the two. We do face in the United States what Pasi Sahlberg calls a germ, the global educational reform movement, the germ, and its goal in the United States is the destruction of public education, I think. In the world, it's the homogenization of education and the standardization of education through OECD and PISA and places like that. But in the United States, it's probably the destruction of public education that represents the germ. In a way that you'll understand why we're so angry is that our former superintendent of public instruction, happily now voted out of office, but being replaced by someone equally odd, is in Arizona. He made 15,000 robocalls last year, telling parents to pull their kids out of public schools and put them in charters and private schools and get the tax credits. So that's our chief state school officer, okay, telling parents go to private schools and charter schools. So why would he do that? Well, he's bought and paid for by ALEC and the Waltons and the Broward Foundation, who are all out for the destruction of our public schools, we think. So others that have said funny things and hurt the schools and that we reacted to, and part of the reasons we wrote the book, include one of the richest people in the world, Bill Gates, who may be a very nice man. He gives a lot of money to medicine, but he doesn't know education very well. He said, education's pretty bad. We've increased the funding and the scores are flat. That's a quote from Bill Gates. Well, funding has gone up for education, and it's true. But what he doesn't understand is that part of the reason it's gone up is a huge increase in special ed costs, and for some of the kids in special ed, a huge increase in even the regular costs for special ed. So some kids are costing 5, 6, 7 times more than even the special ed costs. And that's something this country should be proud of. We made a commitment to help families and help kids. We've actually changed Europe and the rest of the world in their views of special ed. A lot of that started at this institution with Sam Kirk, probably 50 years ago, and there's something to be proud of in both this institution and our country, and Bill Gates doesn't understand that commitment is a commitment to community life, to the commons, to help people who have children that need help. He doesn't understand that transportation costs have gone up. He doesn't understand that testing costs have gone up. I mean, there's profits to be made, so tests are expensive. They're usually not made by the states anymore. They're made by companies like Pearson, and they make a nice profit. The new tests are all technology-based, so platforms have to be installed. So costs are up all over the place. So he misunderstands the cost issue, but he also said that the scores are flat. Okay? And so I went back and looked at the NAEP scores to see what I could find. And here's the NAEP scores from 1978, 1980 to 2012. Mathematics age 8, mathematics 13, reading 9, reading 13. They're up 28 points, 34 points, 31 points, 21 points, 34 points, 33 points, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is no sense that the scores are flat. Bill Gates lied. Okay? Now, if I had $50 billion in my bank account, for $15 an hour, I'd probably hire a fact checker. Okay? He does, but when important people say things like this, then we all get in trouble, because then the public buys it, it gets into the newspapers. So that's the kind of stuff that drove us crazy. Also, the newspapers, particularly the Arizona Republic, my newspaper, and the New York Times, America's most prestigious newspaper, say things that either aren't true or need a lot of explanation, and that was part of the background for the book also. The journalists claim that the Chinese and Koreans are outperforming us, that those kids are so much smarter than ours. Moreover, they say the Chinese will soon be the world's #1 economic power, leaving the U.S. in the dust. That may be true, but right now, 500 million Chinese earn under $2.50 a day. 500 million. Okay. Last year, family income in urban areas was about $2,600 U.S., and in rural areas it was $1,600 US. Their measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, is actually larger than ours, and ours is terrible. And that means that China has even a more unequal society than we do, and that's causing us a lot of trouble. It must be causing them a lot of trouble, or will. If you want to know how bad the Chinese system is and how good it is, it's good on taking tests, and how bad it is in everything else we value, the new book by Yang Zhao is called Who's Afraid of the Big Red Dragon? And it documents clearly that China is a wonderful place to get high scores, and it's a terrible place to be a child. The worriers in the newspapers say we need a much more rigorous curriculum, much more testing, and even kindergartners should be given more rigorous homework and be tested. But left out of all that is a terrific invention we in the West produced about 200 years ago. We invented childhood, okay? I mean, childhood didn't exist before about 200 years ago. Kids worked in their mother's kitchen, their father's shoe shop. They mucked out the stables on the farms because so many people were farmers. And by 8 years old, in the factory times, they were put on machines in factories. So we invented childhood, and I think Americans like it, okay? I mean, that's something to think about, because right now we have people trying to take away childhood by testing kids very young, getting them career and college ready at age 5, at age 7. This is bizarre, you know? And here's a quote from Arnie Duncan. We should be able to look every second grader in the eye and say, you're on track. You're going to be able to go to a good college, or you're not. Well, this is what I meant when we say sarcasm is all we can do. This is a stupid statement, okay? This is a statement about a person who thinks you can label 7-year-olds and tell them that they're failures and then wonder why they don't do well in school, okay? We live in an odd world, as you all know. Anyway, somebody needs to tell the president and secretary that most of us like childhood. It's a nice thing to have, and labeling kids is cruel, but it may also be evil. And following their lead, Miami-Dade County set up a system where exams start at preschool and go through summer break every year. And on 172 of the 180 days of the school year in Dade County, somebody somewhere is getting standardized tests. The newspapers reported a story. I'm not sure it's true, because, well, who would think a newspaper would lie? But the newspaper story was that they put one of these kids on a computer, a kindergarten kid, to take the test. And the kid turns around and goes, I can't answer this. I can't read yet. Duh, did they think of that? Anyway, that's the kind of things we're getting. And a teacher, the kindergarten test was so onerous that a teacher stood up and said, you can fire me, I'm not giving it. And they said, okay, you're going to be fired. And then another kindergarten teacher said, she's right, I'm not giving it either. And then a whole bunch of them stood up, and then a whole bunch of teachers stood up, and they withdrew the kindergarten test, which is a lesson for us all. It happened in Seattle also, in one of the high schools, I think it was Garfield High, one of the high schools in Seattle, in which they said they're not going to give the tryouts to the Better Consortium or the Park Consortium. They won't give it, it's wasted time. And the superintendent says, well, we'll fire you all. And then another high school stood up and said, we're not going to give it either. And they withdrew the test. Okay, so there's a lesson for us that, it's a lesson my father taught me. He was a union member. There is solidarity. When you stand together, you can usually win something. But if you do it alone, you probably can't. Anyway, there's a lot wrong with all these arguments that our schools are a failure, and I'm going to talk about that. Excuse me, there's a couple of chairs over here if you can figure out how to get to them. Please do. Okay. There's a lot wrong with the argument that the USA will soon perish because our kids are so dumb. I'm old now, and I can remember Life magazine in the 1950s when I was going to high school. The Russians were going to beat us. Ivan was better than Johnny. And we were told we could not compete. We were lazy. We can't read. The book Why Johnny Can't Read came out in the 1950s when I was a high school student. We liked rock and roll. We were impolite. We smoked too much marijuana, etc. But those high-achieving Russians not only didn't beat us, but my stupid and lazy age mates, my absolutely incompetent friends, led America to eminence at the end of the 20th century, in which everyone agrees it was the American century. And that was my classmates who were so dumb. So you get a little used to this sort of thing. After the Russians, the Japanese were going to beat us because they studied so much more, but they didn't beat us either. Last year, Joel Klein, the former cheating chancellor of New York's public schools, and Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State, who promoted a phony war that bankrupted our country, these two leading lights said that our military is suffering because our schools are so bad. Well, we cannot fight a good fight without higher achieving students, they said. Incompetent school board members, administrators, and teachers are not giving the nation's military what it needs to launch its programs. That's what they said. But what I want to know is how these two might judge our military leaders, since we spend more money, get this, we spend more money on our armed forces than Turkey, China, Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Germany, India, Italy, Brazil, South Korea, Australia, and Canada combined. Now, if we have a problem with our military, we must have the dumbest generals and admirals in the history of the world, okay? Because we've given them so much in the way of resources, and the schools are not getting those resources. Anyway, this constant fear of America going down the tubes is, I've heard it all before. Some of you may know it started with Socrates about 500 BC. He wandered the streets of Athens, worried about the youth. They didn't know the history of Athens. They were impolite to their elders. It's just what old people always say about young people. And Socrates was right. Athens perished 500 years later. He was just off. He was off a little bit. Another point is this. Chinese and Korean childhoods are nightmares by my standards. If anyone in the USA wants to raise a Chinese-style or Korean-style student, they're free to do so. And it is true that they will do well in American schools. Asian Americans beat Japanese and tied with Korea on PISA tests. That is, our Asians beat their Asians, okay? And so if you're raised in a certain kind of culture that has a certain view of childhood, you're likely to do very well. You probably all read the Tiger Mom book or know about it. There is truth to it. You can raise high-achieving kids, but you do so with a different vision of childhood. So if they're free to do it. In our country, we go bonkers over the Super Bowl and other sports. We actually want our kids to engage in swimming, tennis, field hockey, baseball, football. And on weekends, we don't mind if our kids watch TV or play with friends or hang out with the family. The majority of us don't expect our kids to rush into their homework after school, and we approve of some teen dances and dating. Oh my God, teen dancing and dating. We even think it might actually be harmful if our kids actually studied all the time, just so they could get high scores on tests. Well, if that characterizes us to some extent, then with these widespread beliefs about how childhood and youth should be spent, we in the USA will never, never, never compete well with the students of some Asian nations. We got to get over it. We might actually ask a better question, namely, how do our 25-year-olds raised according to our cultural norms do in the world? Now, we have no data on that, but they seem to be doing fine. They're getting patents, they're opening up stores on the web, they're entrepreneurial. I don't see any evidence that our 25-year-olds are deficient. Certainly our 15-year-olds can't compete with some Asian nations. But so what? Who cares? Okay, I mean, the newspapers, clearly. But who cares if we're raising children to our standards? I'm just thinking of the deans over here. I was asked in Australia why they're not competing well with Shanghai and Hong Kong and that sort of thing. So I was on a panel, and I went into the panel with the newspaper from Tasmania, from Launceston. And I went in, they asked me, well, Dr. Berlinder, why isn't Australia doing as well? And I said, well, here's your newspaper. And silence, and I said, let me show you. And the first few pages are local news. Somebody's rose garden had aphids attacking it or something. And, one page on international, 40 pages on sports. You know.
It's the lifestyle.
Okay, so it's tennis, it's rugby, it's swimming, it's Australian rules football, on and on and on. I said, here's the reason you can't compete with Shanghai. Your kids don't want to. And what's more is you're supporting them. And they go, oh, yeah, I never thought of that. So this conception of childhood is very important to interpret the scores from PISA, okay? If we're not competing with them, why would we win? Okay. Duh. Okay. So Anyway, I think our 25 years, I think our 25-year-olds are pretty good. We don't have the teen suicide rate of Korea. We didn't have to pass a law saying at 10:30 at night you have to stop studying, as Korea did. So, you know, it's a different system. I don't have any interest in the test hell, as the Asian kids call it, though that's what our President and Secretary of Ed push for. The question for us, of course, is, are we producing enough graduates and business leaders for our economic system to thrive? That's a good question. And the answer to that seems yes. And in fact, we may be overproducing educated people to fill the jobs that we actually have. Now, I know Jennifer has a project on the STEM areas, and I'd like to present some STEM data to you. This is one of the myths we attack in the book. Here's some STEM data. The circle on the right says 277,000 STEM vacancies per year are needed. Okay, that's what we need to fill. Okay, that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What are we doing about it? Well, on the next column over there, we have 252,000 STEM bachelor's degree recipients. Oh, that looks like it's a lot. We have 80,000 STEM master's degree recipients. We have 20,000 STEM Ph.D. recipients. We have 40,000 STEM associate degree recipients, and we've let in 50,000 people with H-1B visas to help us with the shortage that we don't have. Okay? I mean, can the President and the Secretary of Education add? I mean, it's pretty clear. We're producing 442,000 STEM graduates a year for 277,000 jobs a year. We're producing a surplus of 165,000 STEM grads a year. So where's the shortage? And on top of that, oh, wrong place. We have 11.4 million STEM degree holders who currently work outside the STEM system. I mean, when people lie, it makes it really, really hard to make public policy that's sensible, okay? Now, nobody's against science, math, engineering, and technology training that I know of. Everybody knows we need that. If you like math, let's nurture mathematicians. If you like science, let's nurture scientists. But let's not go around telling everybody we have a shortage, because that's simply not true. Okay? And then getting all the colleges to work on STEM areas. I had a Hispanic student come into me, a Ph.D. student in engineering, come into me and ask if he could transfer a lot of his credits over to education. He'd like to be an educator. And I said, well, that's sure, I bet we could do something for you, but why are you making the switch? And he said, my parents were migrant workers and I don't want to be one. And I said, I don't quite get that. Can you explain that? He said, well, my parents picked lettuce in Yuma and then went up to California Inland Valley picking things. And he said, and the jobs for engineers now are not lifelong. You go to GE, you work on a project. When the project's over, they fire you. You go to another company, they work on a project, they fire you. You get a university job, you're working on a project. When the project's over, you have to find another one. He said, my parents were migrant workers and I don't want to be one. Wow, that's a different view of the field. And I've checked it out, and that's an accurate statement about contemporary engineering and science. So anyway, we have enough STEM jobs. It's also sold to us that they make a lot more money and a lot less unemployment. And except for petroleum engineers, it's an overstatement. Engineers and STEM people do make a little more money, but it's a little more. They do have more stability in employment, but it's a little more stability. And only for petroleum engineers do they make a lot of money. The rest of it is a little more. But you work harder to get your degrees. Are we producing enough people for the jobs we have? In 1970, 1 in 100 taxi drivers had a college degree. 15 taxi drivers today have college degrees out of 100. In 1970, 2 out of 100 firefighters had college degrees. Now 15 firefighters out of 100 have college degrees. It's now likely that 25% of all baristas in the USA, the coffee and bartender people who give us our drinks of both types, have some kind of college degree, 25%. So are we producing enough educated people for the economy? Yes. Is the economy producing enough jobs for educated people? No. That's a whole different view of the situation, okay? So people keep saying nasty things. The reformers want great accountability for the public schools, but not the charters and private schools. They also want incompetent teachers they hear about out, but they don't know that there are very few really grossly incompetent teachers. There are lots of teachers I don't like, but that's different than grossly incompetent, which is the word that's used. And I visited at least 200 classrooms in my life, and I never saw a grossly incompetent teacher. I saw some who were too lenient. I wouldn't put my kids there. Some too strict. I didn't want my kids there. I didn't want to be there. But those are differences than you hear from some people trying to destroy tenure, which says that there are grossly incompetent people out there. But a lot of the people making criticism of the schools want to sell things to the schools at the same time. I don't know if you know the big iPad scandal in LA. $1 billion contract with iPads was let to Apple, and I'm Jewish and from New York, and they paid retail. I'm sorry, but if you have $1 billion and you pay retail, you're really stupid, okay? And they got no discounts at all when they made the original deal. So it's profits that are motivating a lot of the people in the reform movement right now. Anyway, we decided to attack it, and first we took on, the first myth we tackled in the book is what I call the grand myth, and that's the one that our American schools are doing poorly. You hear the Secretary of Education, our President, the New York Times, Bill Gates, American Legislative Exchange Council, Eli Broad, the Walmart family, the Koch brothers, and lots of other people talk about how bad we do in international competition. I'd like to help you think through this. Instead of saying, we do bad in international competition, let's say some of our schools are doing bad in international competition. Okay? That's a big difference, and I'll explain how important that is. Here's what they report on the 2012 PISA. In reading, the U.S. is 21st. In mathematics, we're 32nd. In science, we're 23rd. And all these other countries are ahead of us. And in the U.S. worldview, some of these are dinky little countries. Why are they beating us? You know, with our Americanism is always the right way and the best way. And so keep in mind, these are like the mean scores. Because what I'm going to do now is disaggregate and talk about what the disaggregation reveals. So let's disaggregate right off the bat and go to the TIMSS scores. Up at the top of the fourth grade, TIMSS trends in math and science studies, something like, I forget, 50 nations and some other jurisdictions were involved. And the important thing for us to note is that the bar on the left that says less than 10%, that means less than 10% of the families at those schools were in poverty. The bar on the far right, 75% or more, 75% or more of the families at that school were in poverty. The first thing you notice, of course, is that the kids who are going to schools that are not in poverty, that do not have a big poverty population, they score pretty well, almost a full standard deviation above the average. The kids in schools where the big poor population exists, they score at the average, about a standard deviation below. Standard deviation is a big difference between rich and poor kids, okay? But that we all know that rich kids do better than poor kids. What's important here is that the average score was given, and the U.S. seemed to be modest in its scoring on TIMSS, better than in most tests. But here's the important thing to note. The average fourth grade score of Finland, which is always held up to us as the great powerhouse in international tests, the fourth grade score of Finland on this test was 545. Now, if you look at the kids who went to schools with less than 10% of the families in poverty, and the kids who went to schools with between 10 and 25% of the kids in poverty, and even the kids who went to schools where 25 to 50% of the kids are in poverty, these are middle class and upper middle class kids going to public schools. They beat the Finns, and in the first two groups, that's 12 million kids, and if you add the three groups, that's 25 million kids. So 25 million American kids are as good as the Finns or better, okay, in their performance. The problem is the mean score reflects the other two groups. Okay? Once you add them in, our mean score is much lower, okay, because we have such poverty problems. In 8th grade, the bottom graph shows exactly the same thing. All three groups where poverty at the school site was under 50% tested just fine. They beat the Finns once again. But the implications of this is what's important. There doesn't seem to be much wrong with mathematics teachers in 3 of those categories. 25 million kids are getting good mathematics teachers. They're getting good mathematics instruction. They have a good mathematics curriculum. In any of the schools where poverty is not a problem, our kids are getting good educations. Okay? I mean, there's the data on it. In the other 2 groupings, in schools where we educate about half of America's kids, our kids are doing poorly. What's the takeaway from this? It isn't unions, it isn't the lack of a common core, it's not the lack of iPads or the lack of more school hours or school days, or any of the various other reforms promoted by the GERM, the global education reform movement. It seems that it is poverty that harms school learning, and thus we cannot have higher achieving schools in the USA until we have a progressive society that limits the effects of poverty on our families. My gripe with the Common Core, which is every state is dealing with right now, I'm kind of agnostic whether it's a better curriculum or not. I don't know enough about that. I know there's some things that need to be tweaked in it, like making kids read informational text instead of novels. That's really stupid, I think. You need to love reading. The way you love reading is to find books you love. And when I was 13, I read Captain's Courageous 3 times, okay? I loved the adventure. Well, you pick up vocabulary, you learn a whole lot about the world, and I don't think reading the Declaration of Independence or the Gettysburg Address quite has that to it, so, which is recommended in the Common Core, you know. I have problems with it. But the most important thing is that with data like this, you can't say our curriculum's bad. 50 million kids go to school, 25 million kids will compete with the best in the world with a fragmented, disjointed, terrible American curriculum. How is that possible? Okay? So they lied to us when they say if we change to the Common Core, we'll do better in the international tests. We do just fine now for some of our kids. So, anyway, we get that. So we tell those who say that our public schools are not good that they're wrong. They seem to work quite well when they're allowed to teach kids unscarred by the creation and intergeneral maintenance of a large poor population. Oh, wrong one. This one. Here's the data from PEARLS. These are the reading tests. Again, they're set up the same way. Families with less than 10% of the kids in poverty scored 605, standard deviation above the mean. How did they score in ranking? Number 1 in the world. You go to the second bar, the 2 together. I think the 12 million kids in those 2 bars ranked, I think, 6th in the world or something. The point is, again, it's the same pattern. Our kids are not doing well over on the right, where 75% or more of the families are in poverty. But even then, the newspapers failed to report they were above the international average that took the test. Literacy turns out to be a strength in the United States. With all those books about Johnny not reading, Johnny's reading those books. Okay, so we do actually quite well. Let's go to, so that's PEARLS. And now let's go to PISA, which is the most important of them because it gets the most play. Here's the mathematics data. The bars are set differently here. But you saw the actual mean scores and where we placed in mathematics, and we did terrible. But even in mathematics, our weakest subject, the kids in schools where poverty rarely is seen, that first bar in the graph, those kids placed 6th in the world, and they placed higher than Japan. So we have millions of kids doing pretty good. The next group, schools where under 25% of the kids were in poverty, they were 17th in the world, well above most of the countries in OECD. And Massachusetts, which participated as a state, had kids tied with Germany, the great scientific and engineering engine of Europe. So Massachusetts does very well. Okay? So again, I said I wanted you to change your thinking from we don't do well in international tests to some of our kids don't do well in international tests. That's a big difference, and the data supports what I'm saying. So that's math. Here's science. It's the same pattern. Actually, the kids in the first bar, less than 10% of families in poverty, they actually were beaten by only one other country, as the newspapers reported. Only one other country beat us, Shanghai. Problem is, Shanghai is not a country, but the newspapers fail to distinguish. It's also it's a city. It has the highest rate of college graduates in all of China, and about 200,000 kids in Shanghai were not tested in the PISA test, and they were not tested because they were illegal immigrants in the Chinese sense. They were kids from the farms and Western China who had illegally come to find jobs in Shanghai, and the schools won't take them. Okay, so this is not really good sampling design. It would be like going to Silicon Valley and testing everyone but the Hispanics. You know, I mean, duh. You know. Okay, so you get the picture there. If we go to reading, you know, reading's our strongest area. And something to notice about reading is that if you know science and you know math, it doesn't help you in reading. If you know reading, it helps you do science and math. So our strength is in reading, which is really good. Of all the three areas, that's where I would want our strength to be, and it is. And again, we have the situation here. I won't dwell on it. It's the same situation as before. Pearls taught us that reading's a strength. U.S. kids in the top bar, under 10% families in poverty, place second in the world. You go to the second bar, we were sixth in the world. 12 million kids did great. If we take the third bar, which then includes 50% of all our kids, they came in 10th in the world. So somewhere around 25 million U.S. kids read as well as anybody in the world, and 25 million of our kids do not, and they're in schools where poverty is the key characteristics. Now, let me talk about how powerful these factors are in determining education. I'm going to give you a little thought experiment. I'm going to give you some data, and then I'm going to ask you to decide which American state is going to do better on our best tests of how kids are doing, the NAEP tests, 4th and 8th grade NAEP kids, okay? So I'm going to give you some data, and then I'm going to ask you to make a choice. So in row 1, we're talking about the percent of 3- and 4-year-olds attending a state-associated pre-kindergarten. In state A, it's 8.8%. In state B, it's 1.7%. Looks like state A has an advantage. Are you willing automatically to say state A is going to have higher NAEP scores? No, it's too soon to tell, I think, okay? Unless you're an early childhood educator, and then you say, yeah, okay. But you're premature, so let's think. Row 2, percent of children living in poverty. This is 2012 data. 14% versus 24%. Ooh, difference there too. Let's go to row 3, percent of households with food insecurity. 11.4%, 14.9%. Can you pick already? Do you want to make a choice? Anybody picking state B is better? Ah, look at that, 3 variables. Look how prejudiced you are. 3 variables, you're making snap judgments. Let's go on. State 4, percent without health insurance in 2012, 3.8% versus 17.7%. Row 5, per capita personal income, 55,000 versus 36,000. 8,000 more than the national average, 6,000 less than the national average. Row 6, per capita spending on education, 2,700 versus 2,000. Pupil teacher ratio, 14.5 to 1, 19.8 to 1. Anybody still thinking B could win? No. Amazing, isn't it? Row 8, class size in elementary grades, 18.7 versus 23.5. Class size in secondary grades, 20 versus 25. Percent with bachelor's degrees in the state, 38% versus 26%. Public libraries, there's a good one for the literacy people in the audience. Public libraries, 370 versus 69. In one of these 2 states, if you want to read, you can. In the other state, it's a little more problematic. Percent teachers with master's degrees, 62% versus 41%. Teacher salaries, 72,000 versus 46,000. During the recession, salary change, that should be 1.5% up versus 1.8% down, mimicking what most of the country saw for teachers, which is a reduction in pay. Okay, is there anybody here who has any doubt about the outcome? On NAEP results of 4th grade, State A tied for first, 16% scored advanced in reading. State B was behind 32 other states, 7% scored advanced. 8th grade, same pattern, reading high, lots advanced in State A, reading low and behind most states for State B. State A and B really exist. State B, you may have guessed, is my own Arizona. An embarrassment to us all, but it's by design. Okay, this is not happenstance, it's by design. Okay, last year we had 6,000 phone calls to Child Protective Services about child abuse, child beating, child malnourishment, and child sexual abuse. 6,000 phone calls went unanswered because we didn't have the money. That's a political decision. Okay? We don't care about children in Arizona. State A, which does a lot better, is Massachusetts. Some of you may have guessed. Massachusetts is a generally progressive state in politics. With all its warts, it resembles Northern Europe, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, more than it does Alabama, Mississippi, or Arizona. States and nations that are more progressive, according to UNESCO data, take better care of their children. With few exceptions, our politicians appear less likely to kiss our babies and more likely to hang out with individuals and corporations that won't pay the taxes needed to take care of those babies, therefore ensuring that our schools do not function well. But that's political commentary. Here's the most important part of this thought experiment for all of us who care about education. Everyone who I've ever done this little experiment with predicted that State A would outperform State B. And just like you, they did so without knowing anything about the unions. They didn't know anything about the curriculum. They knew nothing about the quality of instruction, the quality of leadership in the schools, the quality of the teacher ed programs, etc. Predictions about achievement were made by you and others without recourse to any of the variables the anti-public school forces love to shout about. Incompetent teachers, tenure, dumbed-down curriculum, coddling of students, not enough what? Discipline. Not enough homework, poor leadership, and so forth. From a few variables about life in two different states, you were able to predict differences in student achievement quite quickly and quite accurately. So what does it tell us? It tells us that schools may not be important in determining the test scores the way we think they are. You all predicted the outcome pretty well. Okay? There are lots of people now predicting the outcomes of state test scores by zip codes. Percent with college degrees, percent with high school degrees, job rates, unemployment rates. We can predict the rankings of virtually every zip code in America using outside of school data. Not only are the tests insensitive to instruction, they are much more reactive to the out-of-school variables than the inside-of-school variables. The context, the cohort, the composition of classes in schools strongly affect the group data obtained. The test scores that a class or a school provide for the national exams or the international tests are much more likely to, are just insensitive. Teachers can have huge effects on individuals but not on the test scores. In fact, the composition effects and context effects, child rearing practices, cultural practices, almost always trump teacher effects or school effects when we look at the aggregate standardized test score data. The myth that teachers in schools can make a huge difference in the lives of kids in poverty or from cultures that are not the ones from whom our schools were built is just that, a myth. It was a book coming out next week by Joel Klein, a person I've already called a cheater. Richard Rothstein called him a liar. That's even stronger. Joel Klein's new book is coming out next week, and he says, quality is the issue, not poverty. He says, a great teacher can rescue a child from a life of struggle. Well, I would agree with that. A great teacher can rescue a child from a life of struggle. They do it all the time. They don't change the test scores very much. The statement is not incompatible with mine. Teachers touch eternity. They change lives every day for kids. They do not affect the metric we're using to measure them very much. Joel Klein commits what's called the Medal of Honor fallacy or the composition fallacy. It's philosophy 101. Just because one teacher does it, then why doesn't every teacher do it? Okay? So a teacher can change the lives. So every teacher should be able to. This is like those people who start yelling, poverty is no excuse. That becomes an excuse not to do anything about poverty. Okay? We have teachers who make a difference. There's a famous study of Miss A teacher who changed the lives of her kids. Tom Barone's book, Touching Eternity, is about a teacher who sits on his students' shoulders 20 years after they had him for a class. Teachers touch eternity, okay? Schools can occasionally make a difference. A book by Casanova, who happens to be my wife, Ursula Casanova, a book called Si Se Puede, is about a school in Yuma. Poor kids, lettuce pickers, the sons and daughters of lettuce pickers, 82% go to college every year and have for 20 years. So an occasional school can do it. An occasional district can do it. David Kerp's new book about Union City in New Jersey. Exceptions exist. They don't change the rule. Okay, the rule is that poverty really affects the scores of kids, despite the exceptions. Within a mile, for policy people here, within a mile of this campus, I can find somebody who's 80 years old, smokes a pack and a half of cigarettes a day, and is in good health. Okay, I can find another person, maybe even the same person, drinks half a bottle of Jim Beam a day, okay, and is 80 years old. Do you take the labels off cigarettes and off alcohol because exceptions exist? Of course not. Your public policy has to be made on what's usual. Usually, poverty is going to kill kids in neighborhoods, okay? Even though the exceptions exist, and we should laud them, honor them, study them, but it's hard to get replications of what they do. Here's the data that most of us will agree to. The green shows out-of-school factors. This is from Ed Hartle's amalgamation of a lot of studies. He says that about 60% of the factors affecting test scores are out-of-school factors. About 20% are in-school factors, half due to the school, half due to the teacher. So you're talking about a 3-to-1 ratio if you're talking about out-of-school factors to school factors, and you're talking about a 6-to-1 ratio if you're talking about out-of-school factors to teacher factors that make a difference in test scores. Where are you going to put your money? Okay? I mean, we do miracles all the time with our 10% of variance accounted for. We got the 10% variance for 12 years. We can do wonders with it. But the problem is that you got this powerful family and neighborhood effect, and if you had $10, bet on that. Okay? Even though we do miracles. Okay? So that's the day. The other thing to think about that the policymakers don't think about is how much time a child spends in school between birth and 18 years of age. You can go home tonight and calculate it. How much time is a child in school between birth and 18 years of age? The answer is 10-12%. 88 and 90% are spent in family and in neighborhood. If those are toxic, we have a problem. Okay? So that's why we get data such as this. Okay, let's see, I have about 5 minutes. What do I want to do? Okay, here's a batch of the out-of-school factors that are affecting what's going on in school. Percent of low birth weight children in the neighborhood, inadequate medical, dental, and vision care, food insecurity, environmental pollutants, family relations and family stress, percent of mothers at the school site that are single or teens, and on and on and on. I shared this with the judge in the Vergara trial. He found it useless. Okay, he said, teachers are responsible. Well, okay, judge. Here are the in-school factors that teachers have no control over, but which affect what they can do in the classroom: class size, quality of the principal, collective efficacy of the faculty, teacher turnover, teacher churn rates, quality of the school facilities, etc. These affect what teachers do in a classroom, and they're not under the control of the teacher. So we have 60% outside of school factors. We have another 10% inside of school factors. We have like 70% of the variance being accounted for by things that the teacher can't control, and we're blaming teachers for the problems of American education, and it's just not fair. Most of you know that the American Statistical Association came out this year with a statement, an amalgamation of all the studies they could put together, that teachers account for between 1 and 14% of the variance in student test scores. That's the best data we have. Okay? On average, most of us say 10%. Okay, so we think that we need to rethink a lot about who we're blaming for our problems and what we blame for our problems. In 4 minutes, let me say what else did we try to do. We try to demystify the Move On When Reading program in Arizona and Florida Reads program. These are the ones where you fail kids in the 3rd grade if they're not reading well. The only problem is it's discriminatory. It's almost always males. It's almost always blacks. It's almost always Hispanics who get left back. And if you're a black male and poor, your odds of being left back are way over a white middle-class kid. On top of that, it doesn't work. I'm going to guess for 98 kids out of 100 that we leave back, it's the wrong choice. It destroys family relationships. The politicians in my state said, we are giving our children in Arizona the gift of time. And the children responded in a survey on how being left back felt to them, this wonderful gift of time. They said it was the emotional equal of, get this, wetting their pants in school or being caught stealing. And when given another list and said what was it like compared to these things, they said only 2 things were more distressing to them: the death of a parent or going blind. Okay, that's the gift of time we're giving our children when we leave them back. That's cruel. It's against the research. We have study after study that says it doesn't work. Another myth we take on is the early childhood myth. We have the president of the Goldwater Institute saying, quote, for nearly 40 years, local, state, and federal governments and diverse private sources have funded early intervention programs for low-income children, and benefits to the children have been few and fleeting, unquote. She's a liar. Just flat-out lies about the data. John Stossel quoted her and reports on the air on ABC that preschool is a scam. I quote. Professor Robert Weisberg, is he here? I think he's in Illinois. He's in the middle. He's retired. Let me quote one of your own professors then. I dug that out. He said, listen to this. We cannot assume that low-income parents actually want their children's vocabulary upgraded or exposed to the art and music favored by the middle class. For these low-income parents, a physically safe, clean and nurturing environment with flexible hours is probably paramount. Narrowing academic gaps is undoubtedly far down their list for quality daycare, unquote. Now, if you know who he is, will someone punch him in the nose for me? This is mean, this is cruel, this is horrible stuff. And it's coming from one of your own professors. So we take that on. The PISA data, is really quite clear. You spend an extra $1, purchasing power parity, you get a point increase on PISA. You reduce pupil to teacher ratio, you get another point. You increase the duration of pre-primary by a year, you get 10 points. You increase 1% the proportion of students who attend pre-primary education by 1%, you increase about 5 points. This is PISA amalgamated data, and we have all these people in the Common Core saying, if we put in the Common Core, we'll increase our PISA scores. I can tell you how to do it differently. Plus, the payback is quite well. Somewhere between $2.50 and $9 for every dollar you put into preschool comes back to the community. So it's just cruel not to have a universal high-quality preschool. We show Chris's data. You recognize this, Chris. Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, conservative Christian schools, other private schools, how they look before demographic adjustments against comparable public schools. They all look better than the comparable public schools. Yay for private schools. Minute Chris and Sarah adjusted on the basis of demographic data, they all do worse than the public schools. Okay? So how do private schools and charter schools get their nice scores? They pick and choose. It's very simple. In the charter schools in Arizona, here's what I mean by picking and choosing. If you look at the percent of students eligible for free lunch, these are the 4 outstanding charter schools in Arizona, 2 of them named by U.S. News and World Report as outstanding in the United States. The percent of students eligible for free lunch, 0, 0, 0, 0, and the state average was 35%. This probably happened by chance. Well, that's what they claim. They don't discriminate. The percent of students who are English language learners, 0, 0, 0, 0. Chances working again against the state average of 7.1. Students who have IEPs, under 1%, 2%, 1%, 3%, 12% in the state. This is blatant discrimination with public money, skimming and creaming. And Here's another thing they do in Arizona. You can see for the basis school in Scottsdale, their 6th grade enrollment was 146 kids. They graduated in 12th grade, 21. This is called skimming and creaming. This is getting rid of the kids I don't like. Every school in America, every teacher in America wants to do that, but we can't because we're public schools. And then these people say they have the gall to advertise in the Arizona Republic, 100% of our children go to college. Well, you dumped 120 of them. Okay. So this is the kind of stuff we're working on in dispelling myths. Well, I'll call it quits. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about dispelling myths. So let me just conclude. We have lots of the myths. I recommend that you all protest educational nonsense the way we did, with satire, humor, make fun of people. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founders, said it's okay, and so we felt we could do that. Write your op-ed pieces, write your letters to the editor, go to public meetings, and get back at them. We wrote our book in part because we think that a war is raging for the hearts and minds of Americans. At stake is the nearly 200-year-old institution of the nation's public school system, the institution that more than any other is responsible for the evolution and preservation of the oldest, most successful constitutional democracy in the world. Opposed in this war are two formidable combatants. On one side are the forces of corporate America seeking to gain a share of the billions of dollars expended annually in support of K-12 education. Enlisted in their cores are the American Legislative Exchange Council, hundreds of conservative politicians, and a network of right-wing think tanks. On the opposing side stand thousands of academic scholars, scholars in training, a bunch of beaten-up practicing teachers and school board members, and we stand unapologetically with the latter groups. We hope our groups on these 50 issues at least start interesting conversations, because we are deeply concerned that without public conversations about our public schools, we could actually lose them in the next 3 days. Thank you for your invitation.